Death of the Islamic State leader. Joining me now is Peter Leahy, Director of the National Security Institute at the University of Canberra and former Chief of the Australian Army. Thanks for your time today.
My pleasure, Tom.
So does the death of Baghdadi make any real difference? Does it weaken ISIS, do you think?
It will weaken it, but probably not for long, and certainly won't see the end of ISIS. We saw that with the loss of their territory in Iraq and Syria, they lived on. And al-Baghdadi was just one person. There are many others. They have emirates or wilayats or groups that they call them through West Africa, through Somalia, Yemen, still through the Middle East and closer to us home here in Southeast Asia. So let's not be too happy about this. The terror threat remains. Loss of territory, loss of a leader doesn't mean the loss of the philosophy.
How much do we know about the extent to which he was in charge or masterminded, whatever way you want to put it, if you compare him perhaps to a bin Laden figure?
I think we saw bin Laden, who took a lot longer to come about. He came out of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Bin Laden was more the leader. Al-Baghdadi in some ways was premature and presumptuous. He sort of stood up and declared a caliphate. And in fact, what happened was that bin Laden and others, and al-Qaeda looked at his grouping and said, hey, you're too violent, slow it down, will you? We need to be thinking about doing this properly. So this isn't over by any means.
What about the language used by Donald Trump, talking about acting like a dog, dying like a dog about Baghdadi? I'm not suggesting we should have any sympathy for Baghdadi, but will it be used as a recruiting tool and will it be effective?
I think it was over the top and unnecessary. Let's not declare that Mr Trump should have been gracious, but I think he was totally ungracious. Some people have suggested that it was particularly targeted ISIS and the members in there, talking about dogs. ISIS don't like dogs, many Middle Easterners don't like dogs, but I think it was over the top and unnecessary.
It's been a bit of a constant refrain, hasn't it? The counter-terrorism operations in general, the way they can inspire people to join terror groups. It doesn't mean you can't fight back against terror, but sometimes it's the way you do it. For years, it was the drone attacks in Pakistan and the way they were seen to kill accidentally or through negligence at times civilians. What do you make of what we've seen in the past few years in this area?
Well, I think David Kilcullen put it right. David Kilcullen, an Australian who's made a big name for himself in the counter-terror role in the United States, wrote a book called The Accidental Terrorist, The Accidental Guerrilla. You kill a cousin, you kill a daughter, you kill a son, you kill a mother, and it makes people become more severe. It makes them angry, and they join the ranks of the terrorists. So I think we have to realise that this is going to happen. It doesn't mean we should stop, because we need to get rid of these people, but we do have to recognise that this is something that they believe in very deeply.
Yeah.
I've suggested that we're in this for 100 years. It's a long war. They believe it so fundamentally that the death of a few people is not going to cause them to give up. Others will carry it forward.
What does it mean, though, for this type of operation, evaluating whether the sort of, we must get this leader at all costs sort of approach, depending on, how do you weigh that up? Well, there might be a few civilian deaths. Well, that's okay. They were close to this leader. Are they truly civilians? What's the calculus?
I think from our point of view, if you look at why we went to Afghanistan in the first place, was to get rid of al-Qaeda, to stop the Taliban creating a base of operations, and to stop terrorists in their tracks. Al-Qaeda, this guy and others are totemic. It makes us feel better. It's important that we do that, but we shouldn't ever think that this is going to stop terrorism.
You've been making a couple of calls recently, one for Australian troops to be pulled out of Iraq. So explain the logic behind this. We're still there in a training capacity. You believe they're hardened, experienced enough now, the troops we're supporting, to train themselves?
I do. I think if you look at the Iraqis over the last 5 or 6 years, since al-Baghdadi took Mosul and other places, we saw the Iraqi army almost collapse. But now they've proven themselves to be a fighting force, and I think they're quite capable of training themselves. Our turn is up in Iraq. I also think it's about up in Afghanistan.
I'll get to that in a moment, but so would we still not offer more expertise? Perhaps it's the experience, the enforced discipline. You think, on balance, there's not really much we add anymore?
I think if you look at the other priorities on Australian forces,
right,
they're stronger, closer to home.
The bang for buck's reduced a lot there.
Exactly.
On Afghanistan, so the peace talks are going on with the US. We've got a presence there at the moment. What would we be doing then? Basically saying, well, you know, this process is happening, we'll let the US handle this and pull out?
This is a hard one, but we've been there 18 years. What have we achieved? And you've mentioned the peace talks. If you look at the peace talks, from what I can see of the talks with the Taliban and the United States, not with the government of Afghanistan, it seems to be about to return Afghanistan to what it looked like just before we went there in 2001. So I think we've got to ask very seriously, what have we achieved and what do we hope to achieve? Let's not go into these things without thinking, what's the mission and what does victory look like? Well, victory in this place seems to be, and the Americans have said this, not to lose. Well, how long can we stay there? So I think it's important we ask these questions, and I would suggest that the Australian Parliament needs to talk about these things. The decision to go to war is important,
yeah,
but then we make a decision every day thereafter for 18 years now to stay at war.
I mean, legislation has a sunset clause, for example, when it's controversial, that type thing, that a Prime Minister says, we're going on this mission and there'll be a firm renew date, because they say, you know, what they say in response is, well, our contribution is constantly monitored, but that doesn't set a deadline for, okay, well, let's talk about January 1, 2020, should we still be there and reassess it?
Nor does it allow the Parliament or the Australian public to become involved in these sorts of talks.
Well, the Parliament doesn't, per se, does it?
Well, I think the last time I can recall one of these was in 2010 in September when Stephen Smith took a debate into the Parliament about Afghanistan. Well, let's have a serious talk about it. There's blood and treasure involved.
And that's not a debate on a declaration or legislation, is it? It's a point of everybody have a talk.
Everybody did have a talk, and we came out the same way that we went in. Let's have a serious debate. Let's talk about this.
With these negotiations between the US and the Taliban, what sort of situation do we leave Afghanistan in? Because this is where the concern was. The Taliban, eventually under them, terrorism was allowed to blossom. Why would that not happen again? What sort of accords can be put in there?
Well, let's hope there can be some accords, but the Taliban seem quite firm on the way they're looking at this, and some of the things that I've heard out of there is that they would see Afghanistan run along Islamic lines. And one of the refrains...
Sort of a Sharia society.
Oh, certainly. But one of the refrains we've had, and I think we've talked about this sometimes, our role there was to help little girls go to school. And I think, yes, we got rid of the terrorists, but they're still there. But help little girls go to school, modernise the society, if you like. Well, they seem quite resolved not to be modernised. And so I just begin to wonder, well, how long will we have to stay until they change themselves?
But I want to ask you finally about China. You've also warned against any sort of war against China. We're a long way from that, per se.
Yeah.
But what does that mean our attitude be? I'll give you a couple of examples. One is if there's a Tiananmen-style incident in Hong Kong or consequence or resolution of that, what should our attitude be? Are you saying we shouldn't go too hard in condemnation?
I don't think I've said that. I think we need to be careful about what we're saying. If there is a Tiananmen Square type thing in Hong Kong, I think we have to be very strong and very resolved. But what I'm seeing at the moment out of some officials and some politicians is, I think, ill-disciplined, and they're creating trouble as much as they are trying to solve it. It seems to be more for their personal political reasons rather than for the good of the relationship between China and Australia.
The other thing I'll put to you, so there could be a danger in anything bordering on appeasement. If you look at the South China Sea, you know, there was a line put by Xi in the White House saying, we won't militarise any of these islands. Then he did it, nothing actually happened. Isn't there a danger in that too, that being too afraid of any sort of confrontation, you allow China to slowly spread its influence?
It's almost a bit like Afghanistan. Let's talk about some of these things. What are our interests? What are our values, which are the really important things about China? But then also let's have discussion about what the red lines are.
Yeah, right.
And the problem about red lines is we tend to cross over them. But let's be firm about these things.
So that you'd like to hear a firmly established red line from the Australian government in regards to China, so that if that is crossed, something happens. Presumably something that is worked up with the US, not just us.
Well, I'd like to think in the first place we would have our own views based on our values and national interests. Of course, it would need to be engaged with the United States over this, but I think it's got to be us making these decisions.
Where should it be on China? What's the red line you're looking at?
It's really hard to know, and it's going to be hard for government to say, because once you've drawn a red line, they know where to go to, and they keep pressing up against it. I think the important thing is that we stay engaged. We talk about these things and we talk to the Chinese about it. We have to be true to our values and clear about what our national interests are and be unafraid of saying, well, this is wrong, but at an official level, at a government-to-government level, rather than as part of the discourse of politics back here in Australia.
Peter Leahy, always good to have your thoughts. Thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Tom.